A Serbian-Australian former paramilitary commander has been jailed by a Croatian court for 15 years for war crimes. After a year-long trial, Dragan Vasiljkovic was found guilty and sentenced to jail for torturing and killing soldiers and civilians during Croatia's war for independence. The 62-year-old has dual Serbian and Australian citizenship and was extradited from Perth back in 2015, where he'd been working as a golf instructor. Vasiljkovic's lawyer says he plans to appeal against the verdict. And Natasha Robinson has reported extensively on this case and she joins us now. Natasha, good morning. So first of all, we just mentioned there that he's been found guilty. We've only mentioned the basic outline of the crimes. What do you know of the detail of the crimes he's been found guilty of?
Well, Dragan Vasiljkovic has been found guilty of 2 of the 3 war crimes charges that were levelled at him. They relate to 2 incidents, one at a fortress in Knin, which imprisoned Croatian soldiers. He was found guilty of overseeing torture of those prisoners there. The other charge related to an ambush at a town called Glina, where Dragan Vasiljkovic was in charge of what was described by the UN as ethnic cleansing, and there were 2 civilians killed in that ambush, including a German press foreign correspondent.
And in relation to that first incident, do you know how many prisoners were involved and what was the extent of the torture?
I believe there were 3 witnesses that gave evidence to the court, and what they described, the judge talked about their evidence all being quite consistent. They described being beaten by Dragan's paramilitary troops, having guns shoved in their mouths, being beaten with hands, feet and oxtails was the evidence to the court.
And so these 2 charges relate to 3 people, as you understand it, in the first and 2 civilians in the second?
Yeah, 2 civilians who were killed in that Glina ambush.
Yeah. Okay, so when did you first come across Dragan Vasiljkovic?
Well, I was working for the Australian newspaper at the time. I was working with a colleague in Perth, Paige Taylor, and I was investigating Captain Dragan.
This was back in 2005?
Yeah, this was in 2005. He was rumoured to be back in Australia. He'd been living in Belgrade, where he was heavily involved in a charity that he'd set up there, and he was rumoured to have returned to Australia, and contacts were telling me that he was touring the country raising money for his charitable foundation. So eventually we effectively just drew up a list of what we knew were his interests, and which included yachting, playing golf and Serbian community activities, and we ended up just making a phone call to a Serbian community centre in Perth, which happened to have a golf course attached to it. And the fellow who answered the phone said he knew Captain Dragan. He was going under the name Daniel Snedden at the time, and when my colleague Paige Taylor pressed him, he ended up admitting that in fact he was Captain Dragan. So he gave an interview there on the golf course.
Oh. So were you surprised at how open he was, and at that stage was he effectively a fugitive or not?
Well, he claimed to be in touch with the AFP, and in fact, he produced messages saying, "I tell them everywhere I go," you know, and he was very open about his wartime activities. In the interview he gave, he declared on the golf course, you know, whatever charges are levelled against me, I will answer. I never killed anyone who didn't have to be killed, who didn't have to be killed. So he was living under a different name, Daniel Snedden, the name he'd adopted, but he was quite open about his activities and always claimed that he effectively was not guilty of any crimes.
So what was the process then which eventually led to him being extradited? Because this is 10 years before he was actually extradited.
So after our story was published in the Australian, Croatia immediately issued an indictment. There was a red notice issued by Interpol, and the Australian Federal Police acted on that red notice and arrested him in Sydney. He was then placed in jail, and the extradition proceedings began in an Australian court in the lower courts. A magistrate found that he was an extraditable person, but he went on to fight the extradition for another 10 years and in fact sue the Australian newspaper when it went fully to trial, and in effect a civil court in Australia found in that defamation trial that he was guilty of war crimes.
Wow, okay. And so was he in custody for that 10 years or was he released?
On and off. He was in custody for several years, and then he was granted bail. And in fact, when he was granted bail, he went he disappeared. So it went to the High Court, his case, and his bail was revoked when the High Court said he in fact was an extraditable person. He'd been granted bail after a federal court found that he wasn't, and then he went on the run, and he was tracked down by the AFP at a dry dock on the mid-north coast of New South Wales, fixing up a yacht to sail to Geneva.
So he was heading back to Europe anyway.
He was going to claim asylum in Amsterdam.
Right, okay. So how do you, now that we've got to this point today where there's this successful prosecution, how do you believe, and you might have been in touch with them already, but the Croatian and Serbian communities in Australia feel about this?
Well, the Serbian community has always supported him. They backed his court cases for many years. They gave countless amounts of cash to him and defended him. He was a very polarising figure. The Croatians believed that he was a war criminal. A lot of the Serbian community believed that he was a hero. He had his own comic strip in Serbia at the time that he was a very prominent paramilitary commander. He was seen as a very good leader who whipped troops into shape and ran a very tight ship with his paramilitary troops.
And had contacts with the highest levels of the Serbian regime?
Yeah, he ingratiated himself into the power structure of Serbian dictator Slobodan Milosevic. He was in touch with two of the senior commanders there who were intelligence operatives, and he was identified by a tribunal in the UN as being part of that central power structure.
So how important is this prosecution, which has only just happened in the past few hours, in going towards healing the resentment that is still felt very deeply between so many communities there in that region of the world?
Look, there's been several war crimes prosecutions, and the court who handed down this verdict is a specialised war crimes court in Croatia, but there's still that old refrain that the Serbian community don't see it as legitimate. In the international community, it is seen as a very, very much a legitimate court. Those judges have been trained by war crimes prosecutors from the UN, and but in the communities, it will always be, for the Serbian community there, I'm sure it will be an unfair verdict.
Still very deep divisions. Okay, Natasha Robinson, thanks for talking to us this morning.
Thanks, Joe.